So thank you all so much for coming today, and this is a program I've been looking forward to for a really long time. This is the final in our series on the wonderful and heartbreaking stories about both the Jews who survived the Holocaust by going through Shanghai, but also the fascinating stories about the Jewish presence in Shanghai that really helped form that amazing city. So if you've had a chance to view the exhibition downstairs, you'll certainly have learned some of the names of those famous families that were part of that earlier history. However, today we're really focusing on the history of World War II and the Jews who came through Shanghai as a means of escape from the Holocaust. And this series, the Jews of Shanghai series, was supported by a group of donors that I wanted to acknowledge. Barbara and Richard Rosenberg, Barbara and Gerson Bacher, Nancy and Stephen Grand, John and Lisa Pritzker, and Mem Dryan Bernstein, and Deborah Strobin. So I just wanted to give them a shout out of our appreciation for their support to allow us to do all this programming, which included lectures both here and at the Contemporary Jewish Museum, as well as several films. Today we have 3 speakers, and the first speaker will have a slideshow, and we'll start with that speaker, and then we'll have 2 additional speakers, both of whom lived in Shanghai during the war, and we'll be telling a little bit about their stories. So our first speaker, Man-Li Ho, will be introducing the other speakers, and she introduced them to me because she's been doing research about her father, and that's how I think she came to know both of these individuals. So I won't tell their story, I'll let them tell it, but Man-Li Ho has done incredible research about the history of her father and the work that he did, the part that he played in helping some of those Jews that were coming out of Vienna, but she also has an interesting career of her own as a journalist, so I think her passion, her interest is wonderfully supported by her training as a journalist. So without anything further, I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming to the podium Man-Li Ho.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Wow, this is loud. It's a privilege for me to be here today as part of the Asian Art Museum's year-long celebration of Shanghai, and to talk about how Shanghai became a means of escape from the Holocaust and the role that my father, the late Dr. Feng Shan-ho, who was a diplomat in Vienna, the role that he played in those rescues. But first, I'd like to introduce 2 Shanghai survivors who will be joining me this afternoon with their reminiscences and their perspectives. The first, ladies first, the first is Lottie Marcus, PhD, who is first and foremost a survivor. She and her parents obtained visas from my father in Vienna in 1938, and now at 83, she's hooked on the issues we'll be talking about today. Secondly, she says she's blessed to be a mother, wife, and grandmother. In her working life, she's proud to have created, with her husband Alan, a pioneering English as a second language curriculum for farm workers in Salinas. Subsequently, she was director of cross-cultural medicine at Natividad Medical Center in Salinas, and since 1994, she's had a practice in clinical psychology in Monterey, specializing in geriatric trauma and chronic illness issues as they intersect with the enigmas of mental illness. René Wildorf eluded the Nazi killing net by escaping from Berlin to Shanghai. He's a retired mechanical engineer. He's active in the Jewish community, and he is a leader and organizer of a number of Shanghailander reunions, one of which I had the pleasure of attending a few years ago. René is also the webmaster of the Rickshaw website for Shanghailanders since its inception, and he and his wonderful wife Ruth are proud parents of 2 daughters and grandparents of 4. Now, I'd like you to give you a little background on this history, starting in 1938 and 1939, which was before the beginning of World War II. The port city of Shanghai not only served as a refuge of last resort for European Jews during World War II, the very use of its name as a destination provided thousands with a means of escape from the Nazis. Well before Nazi policy turned to genocide in 1941, anti-Semitic violence and persecution prompted thousands of Jews to flee Germany and from 1938 on from Nazi-occupied territories. Their flight was fraught with difficulties and obstacles. Jews seeking to emigrate needed permission in the form of an entry or end destination visa from the countries they were trying to enter. Even the countries they would pass through required permission in the form of transit visas. Many countries, and certainly almost all of the 32 participants of the Evian Conference in 1938 to address the Jewish refugee problem, had anti-immigration policies and were unwilling to open their doors to Jewish refugees. Now, if a Jew was able to obtain a visa from a foreign consulate, the next step was to obtain permission from the German authorities to leave. So following the Anschluss, which was the union of Austria and Germany in March of 1938, Adolf Eichmann, who became one of the architects of the final solution, set up a center for Jewish immigration in Vienna. That became a model of systematic persecution and oppressive bureaucratic policies for immigration. This model, which combined economic expropriation with the coerced expulsion of Jews, was subsequently instituted in all Nazi-occupied territories. This prompted the American journalist Dorothy Thompson to observe, quote, "It's a fantastic commentary on the inhumanity of our times that for thousands and thousands of people, a piece of paper with a stamp on it is the difference between life and death." From 1938 on and into the war, a number of foreign diplomats working in Nazi-occupied territories seized a unique opportunity to save Jews. These diplomats took advantage of their special status to engage in a bureaucratic shell game. They were often going against the policies of their home governments or bending the rules in ingenious and intricate ways to help Jews. My late father, Dr. Feng Shanho, was one of the first diplomats to do so. So, this is a period photograph of my father. He was stationed in Vienna, Austria in 1937. That's his diplomatic passport. And 2 months after the Anschluss, he was appointed the Chinese Consul General. He watched in horror as Hitler marched triumphantly into Vienna and as Austrian anti-Semitism erupted in full force. This is a picture of the famous Vienna Boys Choir standing under a banner which says, "We sing for Adolf Hitler." My father, having witnessed Hitler's march into Vienna, later recalled that the women were particularly fanatical in their welcome. In Vienna, in particular, the historian Saul Friedlander would later write, "Persecution of Jews, quote, outpaced that in the Reich. Public humiliation was more blatant and sadistic, expropriation better organized, forced immigration more rapid. The Austrians, their country renamed Ostmark, seemed more avid for anti-Jewish action than the citizens of what now became the Old Reich." Reichsreich. These are pictures of Jews who were hauled out and forced to scrub the streets with Nazi hooligans and bullies looking on, and they were forced to scrub the streets with acid. At the same time, the windows of shops owned by Jews were branded with the word Jew. Less than a month after the Anschluss, the first Austrian Jews were sent to the concentration camps of Dachau and Buchenwald. They were told by Nazi authorities that if they emigrated from Austria immediately, they would be released. Many Austrian Jews wanted to come to the United States, but the U.S. not only required an affidavit of financial sponsorship, but had long ago filled its Austrian quota. Those who wished to go to Palestine found that Britain, under pressure from the Arabs, had severely reduced the quota for Jewish immigrants. In order to bar Jewish refugees from crossing their border, the Swiss demanded that Jews be identified by a red J stamped on their passport. This is the passport of Lottie. She was 11 years old at the time. And you can see the red J in the upper corner, and I will leave it to her to tell you more of her history at that time. So as daunting as the Nazi-instituted bureaucratic immigration process was, it paled in comparison to the difficulties of finding a place for Jews to emigrate to. This led to some very bitter black refugee humor. There was a joke, it was called Witz, which meant the globe, which told of a Jew who went to a travel agency shortly after the Anschluss. He inquires about immigration. The agent brings up several countries which are promptly discounted. One requires an exorbitant amount of money. Another requires a labor permit. A third does not admit immigrants, and so on. While the two men are reviewing the options, they twirl a globe on the desk. Finally, the desperate Jew says, "Haven't you got another globe?" So obtaining immigration papers became a desperate and agonizing quest for survival, and this is how one Austrian survivor described this nightmare. Visas. We began to live visas day and night. When we are awake, we are obsessed by visas. We talked about them all the time. Exit visas, transit visas, entrance visas. Where could we go? During the day, we tried to get the proper documents, approvals, stamps. At night in bed, we tossed about and dreamt about long lines, officials, and visas. All the foreign consulates in Vienna were besieged by desperate Jewish visa applicants day after day, but most did not offer help. This is a picture of the line in front of the Polish consulate in Vienna in 1938. My father could not bear to stand by. He later recalled, "Since the annexation of Austria by Germany, the persecution of Jews by Hitler's devils became increasingly fierce. The fate of Austrian Jews was tragic, persecution a daily occurrence. There were American religious and charitable organizations." He's talking about the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which were urgently trying to save Jews. I kept in close contact with these organizations. I spared no effort in using any means possible. Innumerable Jews were thus saved. The ingenious means my father pioneered in Vienna to help Jewish refugees was to issue them visas to one particular place, Shanghai, China. This is the passport and visa of Richard Rubicek. The Nazis had decreed that every Jewish man was to bear the name Israel, which you can see, and every woman to bear the name Sarah. This is the passport and visa of his wife, Josephine Rubicek. The Rubiceks obtained Shanghai visa serial numbers 3,396 and 3,397 from my father's consulate on March 18, 1939. They and their daughter Lisbeth escape to Shanghai. Now, the interesting thing is that no documents were needed at the time to enter into Shanghai. The reason is that the Japanese occupation of China in 1937 had ousted the Chinese nationalist government from authority, and there was no longer passport control or immigration at Shanghai Harbor. So in other words, there was no one to check passports, papers, or entry documents into the port city. So according to the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee at the time, this is a document. Surely this was only too well known to the Chinese consul, a representative of the nationalist government who unquestionably knew, or must be regarded as knowing, that no representative of his government exercised authority at the ports to which the applicant could go. In fact, the real and underlying purpose for the visa was to assist as an act of mercy and humanity these persecutees to escape from Austria. So how were these visas used, if not for entry into Shanghai? The common assumption is that because the visas were written for Shanghai as an end destination, all those who received them must have escaped to Shanghai. Now that's understandable because visas are normally intended for entry into the destination for which they're issued. However, in the case of diplomatic rescue, it's not that straightforward or obvious. Diplomats who were trying to help Jews escape the Nazis often had to find ways around the restrictions imposed by their own governments or by the Nazis. So they used visas, papers, and documents in many unorthodox ways. Some stretched the interpretation of the policies of their home government. Others used every nuance and loophole or feigned misunderstanding of directives or purposely violated their orders. My father chose to violate his orders. The Chinese government had attempted to curtail my father's visa issuing activities in various ways. His superior, Chen Jie, the Chinese ambassador in Berlin, was mindful of maintaining good diplomatic relations with Germany and angry that my father had disregarded his orders to desist from issuing visas to Jews. Using the pretext that there was a rumor of selling of visas, he launched a witch hunt and dispatched an investigator to Vienna who came and announced, who left no stone unturned yet could find no wrongdoing and left empty-handed. Now my father was quite clear in his intent in issuing visas to Shanghai. He said these visas provided proof of an end destination so that refugees could legally obtain transit or temporary visas from countries which otherwise would not have allowed them in. In fact, the majority of Shanghai visa recipients from Austria did not go to Shanghai, but used these visas to find their ways to other destinations such as the Philippines, Cuba, Palestine, England, and even the US. My father said these visas to Shanghai were in name only. In reality, they were a means to help Jews to leave Austria and eventually find a way to the US, Britain, or other preferred destinations. Now, during the trial of Richa Sternbach, a Swiss Jewish rescuer of Austrian and German Jews in 1938 and 1939, her lawyer explained how these visas were used in the illegal Palestine transports in the spring of 1939. Quote, "There were hundreds of passports that were equipped with Chinese visas, although the real goal was to land illegally on the coast of Palestine. These visas were used with the intention of fooling the countries where they passed through, because Italy, for instance, would not give a transit visa unless the final destination was indicated. More importantly, in 1938 and 1939, The Shanghai visas were useful to gain the release of those who were jailed or in concentration camps, such as Dachau and Buchenwald, especially after Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, on November 9th and 10th, 1938. On that night, the Nazis unleashed a rampage of burning, looting, and terror in Germany and Austria, which the historian Sir Martin Gilbert called the prelude to the destruction of Europe's Jews. These are the charred ruins of the Tempelgasse synagogue in Vienna. That is one of the many Jewish shops that was destroyed. And nearly 30,000 Jews from Germany and Austria, mostly heads of household, community leaders, and businessmen, were arrested and deported to concentration camps. That is a deportation to Sachsenhausen. These are men still in their civilian clothes, standing at roll call in Buchenwald after Kristallnacht. And this last one is Dachau. On that day in 1938, my father faced down the Gestapo to rescue his Jewish friends, the Rosenbergs, who, like these Viennese refugees pictured on board the Conte Biancamano, were able to escape to Shanghai. By the outbreak of World War II on September 1st, 1939, 130,742 of the 206,000 Jews living in Austria during the Anschluss on March 13, 1938, had emigrated. Of the 18,000 Jews who found refuge in Shanghai, approximately 5,800 to 5,900 came from Austria. The rest found their way elsewhere. How many Shanghai visas were issued under my father's watch by the Chinese consulate in Vienna? We'll never know the exact figure. The best we can determine now is that they numbered in the thousands, based on the serial numbers of some still existing visas, including Lottie's, and the only surviving documentation from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, which was a report written by my father's successor as Consul General in early 1940. According to that report, the Chinese consulate in Vienna issued an average of 400 to 500 visas a month to Jewish refugees from 1938 through 1939. In this same report, my father's successor said that the Foreign Ministry had long ago dealt with this issue of visas to Jewish refugees, which left little doubt about what the official Chinese policy was. He said, he reported, when he assumed his post in 1940, he adhered strictly to regulations and reduced the issuing of these kinds of visas to nil. On April 8, 1939, which was roughly a year after my father began issuing visas, he was punished with a demerit by the Chinese nationalist government for disobeying the orders of his superiors. Around the same time, the consulate building at 3 Beethovenplatz was confiscated by the Nazis. That's Beethovenplatz as it appears today. The nationalist government at the time not only didn't protest this breach of extraterritoriality, but refused to give my father funds to relocate. So my father moved around the corner to much smaller quarters at 22 Johannesgasse and paid all the expenses himself. That's Johannesgasse today. My father was never reunited with any of those that he had helped. He was unknown to most of them. After his death in 1997, it was only by chance that the extent of his mass rescue activities became known, even to us, his family. I have spent the last decade documenting and piecing together this history, but we will never know the full extent of his humanitarian efforts. One of the questions I'm asked most often is, what would prompt a man from China to save Jews in Austria when others would not? My immediate response would have been, well, if you knew my father, you wouldn't have to ask. But of course, that's no longer possible. So what I can tell you about my father is that he was a man who strove to live his life according to the best in Confucian and Judeo-Christian values. He was born into poverty in rural China in 1901. This is his birthplace of Yejiahe, in the countryside of the city of Yiyang in the south-central province of Hunan. He lost his father at age 7, which left the family destitute. They were helped by the Norwegian Missionary Society in his hometown, and he was educated in their schools. This is his middle school, which exists to this day. Because of his scholastic brilliance, my father was given a scholarship to the elite college of Yale in China, where he graduated in 1926. Subsequently, he obtained a PhD in political economics from the University of Munich, graduating magna cum laude, and where he saw the rise of Adolf Hitler. In 1935, my father joined the Foreign Service of the Chinese Nationalist Government with a posting to Turkey, thus beginning a 40-year diplomatic career and one that led him to Vienna in 1937. That's my father with the Chinese embassy staff in Ankara, Turkey. My father always felt that he had received a full measure of gifts. He was generous of spirit. He was brilliant, fearless, and charming. He was also incorruptible, straightforward, and conscientious. And coming from me, you know that, of course, I'm not biased at all. He also possessed a hot temper, which I always attributed to his love for the very hot peppers of his native Hunan province. But among his most valuable traits was his capacity for love and for compassion. My father believed that these gifts were not bestowed upon him solely for his personal use, but for that of his fellow man. There's one other facet about him which bears mention, and that is that my father came from a generation of Chinese who felt that China had been humiliated and colonialized by 100 years of foreign imperialism. His generation of Chinese was determined not to allow that humiliation to continue. So in that sense, my father was very sensitive to the persecution and bullying of any peoples. In Vienna, he issued thousands of visas to help Jewish refugees, despite being ordered to desist by his superiors, despite the Nazis confiscating his consulate building, and despite being reprimanded and punished by his own government. He remained undaunted throughout. During his life, sorry about that. I don't know how to get rid of it. During his lifetime, my father neither saw nor received recognition for his deeds. In fact, he rarely spoke of his tenure as the Chinese Consul General in Vienna. Of his reason for helping Jewish refugees, he said simply this: "I thought it only natural to feel compassion and to want to help. From the standpoint of humanity, that is the way it should be." I'd like to leave you with a photograph of my parents' grave in my father's hometown of Yiyang. The ancient Chinese said, 树高千丈, 叶落归根. What that means is a tree may reach 10,000 feet high, but its leaves fall back to its roots. So it was with my father. So in 2007, 10 years after his death, I was able to fulfill his wish to be laid to rest in his native soil. Thank you.